For achievement in directing, the nominees are Alejandro G. Iñárritu for Birdman, Richard Linklater for Boyhood, Bennett Miller for Foxcatcher, Wes Anderson for The Grand Budapest Hotel, and Morton Tildum for The Imitation Game.
Why are there not more black or female film directors? I've often wondered how anyone who's not a white man could look at the history of American cinema and see anything they can relate to.
What kind of a town is this anyway? Selling liquor to Indians.
There are exceptions, of course, but generally the past 100 years of mainstream American cinema have explored little beyond the experience of being a white male. To see why this happened, we need to go back to the early days of American cinema and the film that started it all. The Birth of a Nation is celebrating its 100-year anniversary this year, but you probably haven't heard a lot about this, and for good reason. It's considered to be the first American feature film to define the conventions of narrative cinema, which would make you think it would be worth shouting about. But the film is infamous for its explicit racism. Critics and academics are always reserved in their praise for this film. Yes, its subject matter is horrible, they say, but the story structure and visual language the film pioneered make it legitimately great and influential. No doubt The Birth of a Nation has been hugely influential for the past 100 years. Its method of storytelling has long been considered the norm. But I'd argue that, morally speaking, the film's structure is as despicable as its content. I mean, the content was obviously bad. So bad that the director D.W. Griffith went on straight away afterwards to make a film called Intolerance, which drew attention to the different forms intolerance is taken throughout history. My problem with Birth of a Nation is exactly what critics and academics say is so great about it. The structure it solidified and made an intrinsic part of American cinema. That is, the way the film uses heroes, villains, and damsels in distress, basically characters who act as rewards or motivators for the heroes. Now, before I go on, let me define what I mean when I talk about white supremacy. When we think of white supremacy, this is what we think of. But actually we're talking about a system that promotes certain values at the expense of minorities. If you're a white guy living in the Western world, you probably don't even realize white supremacy exists. If you're a black American, you live with it every day. You see white perpetrators of crimes regularly granted the same sort of sympathy as black victims by the media and the law.
We have victims, 9 of them, but we also have victims on the other side. There are victims on this young man's side of the family.
It was white supremacy Spike Lee was attacking in this famous moment in his film Do the Right Thing. The image stuck with me for years, even though I didn't understand the logic of it at the time. Although it wasn't Sal or his pizza place that killed Radio Raheem, it's the same system in which Sal was privileged enough to own property and in which the police force could kill to defend that property that lowered the value of Radio Raheem's life so that he could be choked to death on the street. In many ways, the message of this film is as pertinent as ever. In The Birth of a Nation, the heroes are the Ku Klux Klan, the villains are the freed slaves who are looking to become equal citizens, and the damsels are the women, children, and elderly. I'm going to admit that the first time I watched this film, I was actually cheering for the KKK to get to the hut before the villains broke into it. That's the power of the structure of this sequence, and the emotions that can be evoked by the hero-villain-damsel dynamic. Now, Birth of a Nation didn't invent this trope in Western culture. In fact, it was a standard of Victorian literature. But somewhere along the line, it was decided that this is how American studios were going to make films, and it stuck. In the years following The Birth of a Nation, the hero-villain-damsel dynamic continued with your pick of villains. It wasn't always used as a means to demonize other ethnicities, and was often used just as a dramatic device. But when filmmakers chose to make villains out of blacks, or Native Americans, or Italians, it was remarkably effective at dehumanizing these groups. Then came World War II, and the Birth of a Nation dynamic proved very useful as a propaganda tool. Casablanca is probably the greatest film made during Hollywood's classical era, but it fits the Birth of a Nation structure perfectly. Rick is the hero, who will defeat the German villain, and Ilsa is the damsel, the hero's motivator. In a time of war, the film was probably very effective in galvanizing support for American interventionism and propagandizing white American values. And knowing what we know about the Nazis, you'll find very few people even today who have a problem with this. But let's flash forward from here to the 1970s and 80s and American cinema's reaction to the Vietnam War. These films, more than any others, show how deeply ingrained the racist standard of Birth of a Nation has become at this stage in the way these films treat the Vietnamese. Not to give too much of a history lesson here, but the reality of the situation in Vietnam before the Lyndon Johnson administration heightened efforts there was that the nation was fighting for independence from all foreign influences, Russian, Chinese, and American. By any balanced standard, Ho Chi Minh was a liberator, not a terrorist. But the US branded him a villain, and surprisingly there are still very few works in mainstream media questioning this belief. To look at the Vietnam War through the lens of American cinema, you would have to believe that the war was one inflicted on young white men by older white men, not one inflicted on a poor nation of farmers by a militarized superpower. This was the era of the crisis of masculinity in American cinema. Now often the villain-hero-damsel dynamic was all between white men. But this internalization of the Birth of a Nation trope treats race in an even more problematic way. We never look directly at the Vietnamese. They are background, disposable, unwilling victims, while we, the white men, figure out this internal squabble we've got going on. Little has changed since this era, except maybe that American cinema has gotten less creative and more repetitive. The white supremacy continues though, and it's not even relegated to small films. Let's take a look at Argo. The premise is that these American diplomats are wanted by the Islamic Revolution in Iran for some vague punishment. Argo is a standard American thriller, and Ben Affleck is a liberal sort of guy, but with its hero-villain-damsel ethos, it ends up making a film in which every single Iranian is considered to be a villain just for being Iranian. The moment this becomes obvious in the film is when a maid working in the Canadian embassy where the American diplomats are staying looks suspicious. Doubt is cast on whether she will expose the Americans because she is Iranian. She has done nothing up to this point to draw our suspicion, but because she's Iranian, she must be villainous, or at least deserves our suspicion. That is the reality the film builds for us. It's not white heroes, black villains, and female damsels, but the effect is the same. Now, how is this different from the philosophy espoused by the Birth of a Nation all those years ago? I don't know much about Iran, but I do know their cinema, and it is among some of the most humanistic and poetic of the last 50 years. I've yet to see a single Iranian film in which an American is shown as a villain. It's just not how they look at the world. Now look at how an African film deals with actual jihadists. Abdurrahmane Sisseko's Timbuktu recounts the real-life invasion of Timbuktu by jihadists in 2012. But this film does not link back to the Birth of a Nation at all. There are no heroes, no villains. The jihadists are shown as real people with real flaws. They do horrible things, but they don't do it because they are evil. They reason themselves into these positions. We can see their humanity despite their despicable acts.
ونحن أولياء الأمور ونديرها حسب ما يمليه الشرع.
I'm not putting forward the notion that Timbuktu is a more truthful film than Argo, or that Argo is a bad film. What I'm saying is that when we have several perspectives, it helps us to work towards our own conclusions about certain people or civilizations. If we let the information we receive about a certain topic flow from one place, then the people behind it can buy and sell us. We stop being individuals and become a mob. So, where's the way forward for American cinema? I don't think the problem lies so much in the fact that these films were made, but that we rarely see films that challenge the assumptions they made. It seems to me the only way forward is to let filmmakers with more diverse backgrounds in to tell their stories how they like. Don't just fund the films that follow the hero-villain-damsel trajectory, because even when you take out your white male hero and replace him with a white woman or a black man, we're not challenging the status quo. Who knows how many perspectives there are still to be expressed in American cinema? Perhaps the beginning hasn't even come yet. One thing I'm sure of, the influence of the Birth of a Nation on these films, packed so heavily with its need to demonize certain people and infantilize others, will wane. Cinema needs to go back to its roots, to look at life rather than the films that came before for inspiration. The forms of cinema that are to come, we haven't even begun to imagine yet. And I don't know about you, but I find that to be an exciting prospect.
Yeah. Whoever thought I'd be the greatest growing up? Yeah. Whoever thought I'd be the greatest growing up? I can eat a pound and 664 powders.